All right. Now, hopefully we are live. We're up and running. What we're going to do is we're going to cover the... this is a great podcast. Now, there's a reason why I follow John Mearsheimer, and I've been following him for a very long time. It's because he's the most accurate in the world. He has been the most accurate in the world for a very long time, and he will continue. I'm gambling on a lot of his future predictions being very accurate as well. He's been very accurate for an unbelievable amount of time. So, hello. How you going? Hey, John. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go through this podcast with John Mearsheimer, and I think, okay. So, before we get into this, I went to my dad's tonight, and he's watching Sky News. You wouldn't believe this. And some of the propaganda is awesome. Some of it is just going against the best interest of Australia. And anyone that supports what's going on over there is going against the best interests of Australia. And I think we're going to outline that from a geopolitical point of view. And this is going to be an awesome podcast because we're just going to listen to it. I'm going to give my take on it. You guys can talk in the comments, obviously. It's just going to be a good one. So what we're going to do is I'm going to let it run for a little bit. When we get to what am I going to do here? I was going to go live and then boil the kettle and put some food in the microwave, to be honest, and then sit down with you guys. Let me just run it from here. Russia in Ukraine, from the master himself's point of view. I think you guys just need to watch it. If you haven't watched this, I'm hoping that this leads to John Mearsheimer getting on Joe Rogan. I'm hoping this is the platform. Get on Lex. Next thing you know, Joe Rogan's like, oh, maybe I should get him on too. I hope. Anyway.
To fast forward in time, but not in space.
And let's speed it up a little bit.
Let me ask you about the war in Ukraine.
I need to speed it up.
Why did Russia invade Ukraine on February 24th, 2022?
I'm boiling the kettle.
What are some of the explanations given, and which do you find the most convincing?
Well, clearly the conventional wisdom is that Putin is principally responsible. Putin is an imperialist. He's an expansionist.
That's the conventional thinking.
Yeah. And the idea is that he is bent on creating a greater Russia. And even more so, he's interested in dominating Eastern Europe, if not all of Europe. And that Ukraine was the first stop on the train line. And what he wanted to do was to conquer all of Ukraine, incorporate it into a greater Russia, and then he would move on and conquer other countries. This is the conventional wisdom. My view is there is no evidence, let me emphasize, zero evidence to support that argument.
Which part? That he would, the imperialist part, the sense that he sought to conquer all of Ukraine and move on and conquer.
There's no evidence he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There's no evidence beforehand that he was interested in conquering any of Ukraine. And there's no way that an army that had 190,000 troops at the most, right, could have conquered all of Ukraine. Just impossible. As I like to emphasize, when the Germans went into Poland in 1939, and the Germans, you want to remember, were only intent on conquering the western half of Poland because the Soviets, who came in later that month, were going to conquer the eastern half of Poland. So the western half of Poland is much smaller than Ukraine. And the Germans went in with 1.5 million troops. If Vladimir Putin were bent on conquering all of Ukraine, he would have needed at least 2 million troops. I would argue he'd need 3 million troops, because not only do you need to conquer the country, you then have to occupy it. But the idea that 190,000 troops was sufficient for conquering all of Ukraine is not a serious argument. Furthermore, he was not interested in conquering Ukraine. And that's why in March 2022, this is immediately after the war starts, he is negotiating with Zelensky to end the war. There are serious negotiations taking place in Istanbul involving the Turks. And Naftali Bennett, who was the Israeli prime minister at the time, was deeply involved in negotiating with both Putin and Zelensky to end the war. Well, if he was interested, Putin, in conquering all of Ukraine, why in God's name would he be negotiating with Zelensky to end the war? And of course, what they were negotiating about was NATO expansion into Ukraine, which was the principal cause of the war. People in the West don't want to hear that argument because if it is true, which it is, then the West is principally responsible for this bloodbath that's now taking place. And of course, the West doesn't want to be principally responsible. It wants to blame Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. So we've invented this story out of whole cloth that he is an aggressor, that he's the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and that what he did in Ukraine was try to conquer all of it. And he failed. But with a little bit of luck, he probably would have conquered all of it. And he'd now be in the Baltic states and eventually end up dominating all of Eastern Europe.
It's amazing when you look at all the different opinions from Australians. All of their opinions come from their own background. You know, if you've got a Russian background, you're going to support Russia no matter what. You know, there's a lot of the elites in Australia that have a British background, you know, French, European, German, Western Europe is their thing. And then you have a lot of, you know, Jewish and Israeli people in Australia pushing their agenda. How many people in Australia actually care about Australia? What about the grand strategy behind keeping Australia safe? So when we're looking at Russia, we're going to get to Palestine and Israel later on in this, which is really important. This is a great podcast, by the way. He outlines everything in detail. I'm of the view, and I think a lot of people are of the view, that around 2008, we should have started warming up to Russia. I made some videos, I think it was 2015, 2016. I uploaded that this was one of the predictions I got wrong. I didn't realize that how incompetent the West was. My eyes are fully aware of just the cattle that run these countries and how stupid they truly are. I need to turn a fan on. It's so hot. It would have been better, a better move worldwide for the United States to warm up to Russia and have some sort of a better economic partnership with Russia to balance China. Things would have been a lot better. We wouldn't have, it's hard to say whether we would have had these issues with NATO, but I dare say with the backing of the United States, they would have pulled back off Ukraine. We'd probably have a lot more peace in Europe, and Western Europe wouldn't be having so many financial problems at the moment, problems accessing, you know, natural resources. And we would have a powerful superpower to help us to kind of balance China. Now, I know a lot of people think, and they're wrong, that a lot of them think that China's going to collapse, their economy is dying. This is actually amazing. Just here's evidence of how stupid people are. People actually believe that China's going to run out of people. The most, just think about how insane this argument is. One of the richest countries on planet Earth, with one of the largest, second largest now, population on planet Earth, is going to somehow run out of people. It's almost like insane that people actually buy this argument. And it's not just that argument. There's millions of different arguments out there of people actually that are just based in any sort of reality. China's a very powerful country. It is no doubt the second most powerful country in the world, soon to overtake the United States. And it would have been better if we had balanced China by having far better relations with Russia. Not exactly an alliance, but something a little bit better. And now, this alternate sort of reality that we're living in is an awful reality. It's an awful reality where you've got Russia and China together, you got the BRICS nations rising, and now we have even Australians. Like, we got so many stupid Australians. I read them in some of the comments there that want to send all of our money and all of our political power and will and embarrass us internationally, send it all to the Middle East for these forever wars. So we're extended into Europe, which is dying. Europe is finished. Like, if you think China's finished, Europe is like 1,000-year-old buildings and castles. These people are so backwards. Let's just be realistic. Why should we be supporting some sort of war over there when over here in Australia we've got our own problems? Why are we sending money and all these resources and all this political will over to Israel right now, when right on our doorstep we've got so many serious problems? And to make things even worse, simultaneously, just to handicap us even more, just tie our hands behind our backs, just to make this game even more fun for us, we're flooding ourselves with some of the shittest immigrants the world has ever fucking seen, just to make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more exciting for us Australians moving forward, dealing with China in our region. It is insane, the stupidity of not only the Australian government, but the Australian people. It is legit retarded what we are doing. We are destroying our country. I just cannot believe what is going on here. But anyway, I'm going to come back in a second. I can hear this, by the way. I'm just grabbing just boiled the kettle and grabbing some food. You gotta listen to this.
As I said, I think there's no evidence to support this.
So maybe there's a lot of things to ask there. Maybe just to linger on NATO expansion. What is NATO expansion? What is the threat of NATO expansion, and why is it such a concern for Russia?
NATO was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It's a military alliance which has at its heart the United States of America, which is the most powerful state on the planet. It is perfectly understandable that Russia is not going to want that military alliance on its doorstep. Here in the United States, we have, as you well know, what's called the Monroe Doctrine. And that basically says no great powers from Europe or Asia are allowed to come into our neighborhood and form a military alliance with anybody in this neighborhood. When I was young, there was this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets had the audacity to put nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba. We told them in no uncertain terms that that was not acceptable and that those missiles had to be removed. This is our backyard, and we do not tolerate distant great powers coming into our neighborhood. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we don't like great powers coming into our neighborhood, it's hardly surprising that the Russians did not want NATO on their doorstep. They made that manifestly clear when the Cold War ended, and they exacted a promise from us that we would not expand NATO. And then when we started expanding NATO, they made it clear after the first tranche in 1999 that they were profoundly unhappy with that. They made it clear in 2004 after the second tranche that they were profoundly unhappy with that expansion. And then in April 2008, when NATO announced that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO, they made it unequivocally clear, not just Putin, that that was not going to happen. They were drawing a red line in the sand. And it is no accident that in August 2008, remember the Bucharest summit is April 2008, and August 2008, you had a war between Georgia and Russia. And that involved at its core NATO expansion. So the Americans and their allies should have understood by at least August 2008 that continuing to push to bring Ukraine into NATO was going to lead to disaster. And I would note that there were all sorts of people in the 1990s, like George Kennan, William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Paul Nitze, and so forth and so on, who argued that NATO expansion would end up producing a disaster, which it has. I would note that at the famous April 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO said that Ukraine would be brought into the alliance, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, the German and French leaders respectively, opposed that decision. Angela Merkel later said that the reason she opposed it was because she understood that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war. Just think about that. Merkel is telling you that she opposed NATO expansion into Ukraine because she understood correctly that Putin would see it as a declaration of war. What did the United States and its friends in Europe do? They continued to push and push because we thought that we could push NATO expansion down their throat after 2008, the same way we did in 1999 and 2004. But we were wrong, and it all blew up in our face in 2014. And when it blew up in our face in 2014, what did we do? Did we back off and say, well, maybe the Russians have some legitimate security interests? No, that's not the way we operate. We continue to double down. And the end result is that in 2022, you got a war. And as I've argued for a long time now, we, the West, are principally responsible for that, not Vladimir Putin.
So the expansion of NATO is primarily responsible.
Yeah, to put it in more general terms, what we were trying to do was turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And it really wasn't NATO expansion alone. NATO expansion was the most important element of our strategy. But the strategy had two other dimensions. One was EU expansion, and the third was the color revolution. We were trying to foster orange revolution in Ukraine. And the basic goal there was to turn Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. And that meant that you'd have Ukraine, if it worked, as a pro-Western liberal democracy that was in the EU and that was in NATO. This was our goal. And the Russians made it unequivocally clear Ukraine was not going to become a Western bulwark on their border. And most importantly, they made it clear that Ukraine in NATO was unacceptable.
Can we talk about the mind of Vladimir Putin? You've mentioned that this idea that he has aspirations for imperialist conquest, that he dreams of empire, is not grounded in reality. He wrote an essay in 2021 about one people. Do you think there is some degree to which he still dreams of the former Soviet Union reuniting?
Sorry, I'm going to have something to eat while I'm watching this with you guys. And no, I don't think there's any evidence that Putin or Russia wants to push West. Because with every country that they take, they need enough men to rebuild and populate each of those and control, each of those countries. So it doesn't make any sense, the argument that Putin or Russia wants to push West. The probability of them messing with Poland in any way, I would say, is very unlikely. It would only weaken Russia. And Russia has other issues. They're on the verge. If they weaken themselves too much, they could be sucked into the Chinese empire. China could take over Russia. It's a distinct possibility. Keep in mind that just the economic intercourse between China and Russia right now could easily get to the point where China is, even whether they don't even want to, just accidentally start pulling the strings within Russia. And so pushing West, it doesn't make any sense that Putin would want that.
No, he's made it clear that anybody with a triple-digit IQ understands that it's nuts to think about recreating the Soviet Union. He thinks it's a tragedy that the Soviet Union fell apart. But as he made clear in that essay, the July 12th, 2021 essay, And as he made clear in speeches immediately before he invaded Ukraine, he accepted the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he accepted the status quo in Europe, save for the fact he did not accept the idea that Ukraine would become part of NATO.
He's been in power for over 2 decades. Is there a degree that power can affect a leader's ability to see the world clearly? As they say, corrupt. Do you think power has corrupted Vladimir Putin to a degree?
It's very hard for me to answer that question because I don't know him and I've not studied him carefully in terms of his overall performance over the course of the 23 years that he's been in power. I've studied him as a strategist, and I've studied how he deals with the West and deals with the international system more generally since 2014. And I think he is a first-class strategist. This is not to say he doesn't make mistakes, and he admits he's made some mistakes. But I think that the West is dealing with a formidable adversary here. And I don't see any evidence that he's either lost speed off his fastball or that power has corrupted his thinking about strategic affairs.
So he has consistently put as a primary concern security, as does the United States. He's put for Russia's security, making sure that NATO doesn't get close to its borders.
I think that's clear. Yeah, I think, as I emphasized early on in our conversation, that leaders privilege security or survival over everything else. And by the way, he gave a number of talks and press conferences in addition to writing that famous article that you referred to on July 12, 2021. So we have, a pretty clear record of what he was saying, and I would argue what he was thinking in the run-up to the war in February 2022. And if you read what he said, it's quite clear that he privileged security or survival. He was deeply concerned about the security of Russia. And Russia is a quite vulnerable state in a lot of ways, especially if you think back to what it looked like in the 1990s, as you know better than I do. It was in terrible shape. The Chinese talk about the century of national humiliation. One could argue that for the Russians, that was the decade of national humiliation. And it took Putin, I think, quite a bit of time to bring the Russians back from the dead. I think he eventually succeeded, but it took a considerable amount of time. And I think he understood that he was not playing a particularly strong hand. He was playing something of a weak hand, and he had to be very careful, very cautious. And I think he was. And I think that's very different than the United States. The United States was the unipole. It was the most powerful state in the history of the world, the most powerful state relative to all its possible competitors from, roughly 1989, certainly after December 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, up until, I would argue, about 2017. We were incredibly powerful. And even after 2017, up to today, the United States remains the most powerful state in the system. And because of our geographical location, we are in a terrific situation to survive in any great power competition. So you have a situation involving the United States that's different than the situation involving Russia. They're just much more vulnerable than we are. And therefore, I think Putin tends to be more sensitive about security than any American president in recent times.
Europe on one side, China on the other side. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah, and we talked before about 1812 when Napoleon invaded and Moscow got burned to the ground. We talked about World War I, where the Russians were actually defeated and surrendered.
Switching gears a little bit and going to a different part of the world, also engulfed in war.
Sorry, I would like to just cover the Israel and Palestine issue, because I don't think many Australians are aware of what this means. And we've got a long podcast to go through. This is 3 hours long, but just jam-packed full of information. Let's get into this.
Let me ask you about the situation in Israel. Why did Hamas attack Israel on October 7th, 2023? As you understand the situation, what was the reason that attack happened?
Well, I think the main reason was that you had this suffocating occupation. I think as long as the occupation persists, the Palestinians are going to resist. As you well know, this is not the first time there has been a Palestinian uprising. There was the first Intifada, there was the second Intifada, now there's October 7th, and there are uprisings besides those three. So this is not terribly surprising. A lot of people hypothesize that this attack was due to the fact that the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Americans were working together to foster another Abraham Accord, and that the Palestinians would in effect be sold down the river. I think, given the fact that this was in the planning stages for probably about 2 years, and the Abraham Accords with regard to Saudi Arabia are relatively new phenomenon, I don't think that's the main driving force here. I think the main driving force is that the Palestinians feel oppressed, as they should, and that this was a resistance move. They were resisting the Israeli occupation.
So this is where most journalists would ask John Mearsheimer, do you condemn terrorism? Do you condemn terrorism? This is a terrorist attack. Well, I don't think Lex Fridman's going to ask that question. But if we were to just look at what John Mearsheimer said just then, he wasn't calling it terrorism. He was technically calling it a resistance movement, almost like a freedom fighters fighting for freedom because they're oppressed. That's John Mearsheimer saying it. I'm just kind of interpreting it.
So that resistance, the attack, involved killing a large number of Israeli civilians. There's many questions to ask there, but one is, do you think Hamas fully understood what the retaliation will involve from Israel into Gaza?
They had to understand. I mean, you had, Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. It started, I think, right after Christmas 2008, and it ended right before President Obama took office in January 2009. And the Israelis periodically do what they call mowing the lawn, where they go into Gaza and they pound the Palestinians to remind them that they're not supposed to rise up and cause any problem.
And this is reflected. It's amazing human psychology, just how people think, how easily people are brainwashed, just insane. How many Australians are unaware of the real facts of what this means here? But what did he just say? He just said that the Israelis go in there and just mow the lawn. They just go in there and periodically just murder innocent civilians, so that there's not too many of them. And secondly, the second point was this so-called terrorist attack. That's what everyone's calling it. And do you condemn Hamas? We didn't touch on that. John Mearsheimer just called it a resistance movement. It'd be interesting to hear what you guys have to say about that. But he didn't call it a terrorist attack. He called it a resistance movement. Freedom fighters, people fighting for their freedom. And if someone was coming in and killing your friends and family periodically for absolutely no reason, then that would be the definition, right? It's amazing how many people don't know this. This is probably one of the most controversial podcasts out there right now. I do recommend that you guys read The Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer. It's called The Israel Lobby. Get a little bit of an understanding on how that works as well. Really valuable stuff. If you could be bothered doing the research. I have noticed that the average Australian doesn't do any research, doesn't know anything. It's insane. The understanding on how the world works from an Australian point of view, it is insane, But anyway, this is a juicy part of this whole interview or podcast.
there's no question in my mind that the Hamas forces understood full well that the Israelis would retaliate, and they would retaliate in force, as they have done.
Yeah, even the metaphor of mowing the lawn is disturbing to me in many ways. I actually saw Norman Finkelstein, I think, say that, well, then if you use that metaphor, then you could say that Hamas was also mowing the lawn. And it's such a horrific image because the result on either side is just the death of civilians. I mean, let me ask you about the death of civilians. So during the attack, 1,400 Israelis were killed. Over 240 were taken hostage. And then in response, as we sit today, Israel's military response has killed over 10,000 people in Gaza. And given the nature of the demographics, it's a very heavily young population. Over 40% of them are under the age of 18 of those killed. That's, of course, according to Ministry of Health of Palestinian Authority. So what do you think is the long-term effect on the prospect of peace when so many civilians die?
I mean, I think it's disastrous. I mean, the only way you're going to get peace here is if you have a two-state solution, where the Palestinians have a sovereign state of their own, and they're...
Now, that's a video I haven't been game to make. That's like the Taiwan declaring independence. That's how epic that is. The two-state solution. I wonder what Sky News thinks about that. No, I don't think Sky News is in support of a two-state solution. I don't think they're in support of peace either. They're in support of more Australian money being sent to Israel, and more forever wars going on forever in the Middle East. That's going to keep costing Australians more and more money. And the more you guys wake up to it, the more they need to control you. So what they do is they send some of the worst immigrants, most violent, disgusting immigrants to Australia to make our lives so miserable down here that we get distracted. Then they bring in COVID, and then they bring in distraction after distraction after distraction, all the while stealing your money and sending it to wars that you shouldn't be involved in at all.
Is a sovereign Jewish state. And these two states live side by side. American presidents since Jimmy Carter have understood this full well. And this is why we have pushed very hard for a two-state solution. Indeed, many American Jews and many Israelis have pushed for a two-state solution because they think that that is the only way you're going to get peace between the two sides. But what's happened here is that in recent years, the Israelis have lost all interest in a two-state solution. And it's in large part because the political center of gravity in Israel has steadily moved to the right. When I was a young boy, the political center of gravity in Israel was much further to the left than it is today. And it is in a position now, the political center of gravity, where there's hardly any support for a two-state solution. And Netanyahu and the rest of the people in his government were in favor, or are in favor, of a greater Israel. There's just no question about that. Well, on top of that, you now have had a war where, as you described, huge numbers of civilians have been killed. And you already had bad blood between the Palestinians and the Israelis before this conflict. And you can imagine how people on each side now feel about people on the other side. So even if you didn't have this opposition inside Israel to a two-state solution, how could you possibly get the Israelis now to agree to a two-state solution? I think for the foreseeable future, the animosity inside Israel towards the Palestinians is so great that it is impossible to move the Israelis in that direction. And the Israelis here are the key players, more so than the Palestinians, because it's the Israelis who control Greater Israel. It's the Israelis who you have to convince. Now, I want to be clear, you also ultimately have to get around the fact that Hamas, right, is not committed to a two-state solution. But I think that problem could be dealt with. It's important to understand that Arafat and the PLO was once adamantly opposed to a two-state solution.
I will update that one small fact about what John Mearsheimer just said. Apparently, Hamas has updated their charter. They've updated what their, I don't know, their mission is, and a two-state solution is part of that. And apparently, Hamas does, accept Israel as a state. They don't want to get rid of it. So apparently that has changed. So that means that if that is correct, then that means that all we're doing is waiting for Israel to enact a two-state solution. And then technically we could have peace, and then we could stop sending money to these people.
Solution. But Arafat came around to understand that that was really the only hope for settling this. And he became a proponent of the two-state solution. And that's true of Mahmoud Abbas, who runs the PA in the West Bank. It's not true of Hamas at this point in time. They want a one-state solution. They want a Palestinian state. And of course, the Israelis want a one-state solution too, which is a Jewish state that controls all of Greater Israel. So the question is, can you get some sort of agreement? And I think to get to the nub of your question, given what's just happened, it's almost impossible to imagine that happening anytime soon.
The cynical perspective here is that those in power benefit from conflict, while the people on both sides suffer. Is there a degree of truth to that? Or for the people in power to maintain power, conflict needs to continue?
No, I don't believe that. I mean, just to take the Netanyahu government or any Israeli government that maintains the occupation, what you want is you want a Palestinian population that submits to Israeli domination of Greater Israel. You don't want resistance. You don't want an intifada. You don't want what happened on October 7th. In fact, I think one of the principal reasons that the Israelis are pounding Gaza and killing huge numbers of civilians, punishing the civilian population in ways that clearly violate the laws of war, is because they want the Palestinians to understand that they are not allowed to rise up and resist the occupation. That's their goal. So I think the Israelis would prefer that the Palestinians roll over and accept submission. In terms of the people who live in Gaza to include the elites and the people who live in the West Bank to include the elites, they would much prefer to move to some sort of...
Yeah, that was a very uneducated sentence by Lex Fridman. You know, geopolitics is something that can take a long time to study and understand. In simplistic terms, let's just say you want trade routes. You would go to war to control a trade route, or you would go to war to control areas that multiple shipping lanes go through, so that you then you have geopolitical power over many countries. Obviously, controlling the flow of oil, controlling the flow of resources. These things are worth dying for. But once you take them, you don't want an ongoing forever war, because it costs money, it costs lives. Imagine if someone was always trying to break into your house. It would cost you a lot of time and money. You're up all night. You'd want them to eventually just submit and quit, which makes perfect sense. And this is why the mowing the lawn comes into play. And so when you think about it from this point of view, understanding that having a forever war with a weak population of people that haven't quit, if you can, if they're just not quitting and they're going to constantly fight you forever and constantly push back, and they're never going to accept being slaves ultimately, what's the other solution? It's a genocide. So that's where the mowing of the lawn comes in. That's where the destruction of the lives of all of those people comes in as well. So, and this is partially why, they bombed hospitals and killed a lot of people that were young people, because they wanted to kill the next generation off. And all the facts back this up.
Sort of situation where the Palestinians have a state of their own. I think in the case of the PA, under Abbas, they would accept a two-state solution. I think what at this point in time Hamas wants is a one-state solution. But they want peace. All of them want peace. The two different sets of leadership in Palestine and the Israelis.
So you think Hamas wants peace?
Sure, but on its own terms. That's the point.
What does peace look like for Hamas?
At this point in time, I think peace basically means a greater Israel controlled by Palestine or Palestinians.
Okay. So essentially, I mean, it's the whole land is called Palestine and there's no Israel.
I think at this point in time, that's their principal goal. I do believe, and there have been hints over time, Jimmy Carter has said this, that Hamas can be convinced that a two-state solution, assuming that the Palestinians get a viable state of their own, that Hamas would buy into that. Can we say that with a high degree of certainty? No. But I think the Israelis should have pursued that possibility. They should have worked with Abbas. They should have worked with Hamas to do everything they can to facilitate a two-state solution, because I think ultimately that's in Israel's interest. Now, the Israeli government and most Israelis at this point in time, I believe, don't agree with that.
What do you think of Israel starting the ground invasion of Gaza recently on October 27th?
The question is, should they continue until they have finally defeated Hamas? There are all sorts of reports in the media, including in the Israeli media, that they're not going to be allowed by the United States to continue this offensive for much more than a few weeks. The Israelis have been saying it's going to take, in the best of all possible worlds, a number of months, if not a year, to finish off Hamas. Well, it doesn't look like they're going to have enough time to do that. I doubt whether they can finish off Hamas, even if they're given the time. I think they're going to run into fierce resistance. And when they run into fierce resistance and large numbers of Israelis going to start to die, they'll lose their appetite for this.
And on top of that, if you defeat Hamas, then the next one will pop up. Because Hamas isn't really a thing. Hamas is really just the Palestinians putting together a group of people to try and push back. You can come up with another name for it. You kill all the people in Hamas, then the next generation will organize a new group and they'll name themselves some other name. And then the cycle will continue, and the embarrassment for Israel and the United States will continue as well.
And the Israelis, surely know at this point in time that even if they finish off Hamas, even if I'm wrong and they're able to finish off Hamas, another group is going to rise up to resist the occupation. The idea that you can use what Zeev Jabotinsky called the Iron Wall to beat the Palestinians into submission is delusional. It's just not going to happen. The Palestinians want a state of their own. They don't want.
That thinking is very feminine, by the way. It's a very feminine way of thinking. You can beat someone into submission. I think most men that have witnessed or seen real violence would understand that when you push someone around too much, no matter how small they are, like a little 4 foot tall Aussie guy, you push him around, you back him into a corner, eventually he's going to come after you. Just don't squeeze people so much. Don't squeeze them. Don't mess with them so much. It doesn't matter how small and how weak they are. They can get you somehow. Somehow, some way, they can come back and get you. So you should always allow your enemies an out. If your enemies want to apologize, give them an out. If your enemies want some sort of a peace deal, if they want a two-state solution, give them an out. But if you think that you're going to squeeze them in an open-air prison forever, and they're not going to push back, and then it's not going to cost you a lot of money, and over a long period of time, no matter how awesome your military is, you are not going to ruin your reputation internationally forever, then you're deluded. It's a very female way of thinking, because women don't get punched in the face, men do. So women often think that they can crush people, and this is also part of what I've been looking at that's been happening in Australia, is that white Australian men have been squeezed way too much, and women in this country they're not aware how squeezed we are and how close some sort of a Palestinian sort of a issue in Australia might pop up. John Calabro, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Hey Dev, how come most Aussies don't care about history? Well, I can't speak for all Aussies, but I will say that most Aussies, from my point of view, they just watch the mainstream media. They don't. It's like the best way to describe it is that Australia's never really been invaded. I know we kind of got attacked by the Japanese, and it was kind of an attack, but it wasn't really. It's not like Japan was ever going to take over Australia, but we've never ever faced like a serious. We've never really been taken over. We've never really had to fight for our lives. We've always been sending men off to help the British Empire or the American Empire. I'm not sure if you can call the American Empire an empire at the moment, but fighting for our allies in wars on the other side of the world and spending our money and sending it that way. And because of that, there's never been a serious threat. So therefore, the average Australian man over time has just forgotten that we're part of the world. And it's almost like if there's no threats, there's no need. If you never run out of food, you never have to worry about it. If you never have to worry about your security, then you don't need to learn history because of that. But if you speak to a Chinese person, you go to dinner with a Chinese man, even an Australian Chinese man, and you want to talk about geopolitics, you want to talk about history of China, man, you might as well sit down with someone with a PhD in history. They will outlay everything. Recently, I was in the pool, and right next to the gym, there was a Chinese guy reading an old school geopolitical book. And I just couldn't believe it because the Chinese guy's sitting there, he's reading his book. I don't know, his family was swimming or whatever. And it's common to see Chinese people reading, educating themselves on history. You speak to the average Australian guy, just naive to history, naive to geopolitics. And if anything, like someone like me, if I have a talk to them about it, if I want to bring up geopolitics with the average Australian man, they kind of look at you like you're a conspiracy theorist. When if I spoke to a Chinese person, a Chinese man about the exact same topic, we could talk for hours about all of the problems that are in the world right now and how they could escalate into serious problems. And when I talk about my conspiracy theories about Sydney possibly getting nuked, how the Chinese towns have been set up around Sydney CBD, and how this major conspiracy theory that I have that we could possibly get nuked as a massive warning moving forward if we get involved in anything. Every Chinese man agrees with me. They're educated on geopolitics. They understand how important it is. But the average Australian, it's like, what? I went to my dad's tonight, and he's watching Sky News. And he's telling me, oh, the terrorists. And I was like, dude, what are you watching? Like he's got a big TV with Sky News playing like every night because he's kind of like a little bit more right wing, which makes sense. Sick of immigration, sick of all of the feminist policies. He's gone through 2 divorces himself. just facts. And he's watching Sky News because it's sort of in line. He's like, oh, the trans. I'm like, oh my God. Because trans is important now because it's some sort of a thing that triggers the women more than anything because the women have the power. But anyway, John, hopefully that kind of answers your question. The fact is that it really is that the Australian people, they just they never really face the threat. So grandpa hasn't had to sit down the kids and have a good talk to them and say, look, the invaders could come by sea and start killing us randomly, try to take over our cities. There's no real fear of that happening because there's no previous example of it happening. And so the complacency amongst Australians is absolute. It's despicable. It's shameful, the complacency. And I know I'm talking about this topic a lot, but bear with me. It's all connected. That also feeds into the there's not much fear of immigrants that could be intelligence agents acting for foreign nations in this country too. And they're more likely to just go, oh, look, there's something going on over there. I like the Russians or I like the Ukrainians. It's almost like they're picking football teams. They're not looking at the world chessboard and seeing how that affects Australia. They're not even questioning how much money we're sending aboard, and they're not even questioning every time an Australian Prime Minister is a smartass and starts mouthing off to a foreign country on the other side of the world, how that reflects on all Australians and somewhat damages our reputation moving forward. How many times has Indonesia got involved in an international spat? Like, is Indonesia is a Muslim country. Are they coming out publicly and chucking tantrums about Palestine? No. Are they getting involved in any sort of, geopolitical discussions? Are they getting their hands dirty at the United Nations? No. This is why this country's rising, and this is what made the United States great. Just shut the fuck up, build your economy, make friends, trade. I don't know, common sense. You can build your country like you can build a company. Why go out there and make enemies everywhere like the Australian government is right now? Because the Australian government is run by women. It's a very feminine way of looking at the world. Women think that they can mouth off to everybody because they don't have any consequences. And that has bled over to Australian politicians mouthing off to every foreign nation all around the world, which they remember. I think Indonesia is a prime example of a country that we should be learning from. And early United States that actually believed in freedom, they weren't mouthing off to people. They didn't even want to get involved in World War II. They only got involved right at the end. They were trading with both sides. So I think complacency is the main issue with the Australian people. But let's get back into this.
To live under occupation. And there's no military solution for Israel here. There has to be a political solution. And the only viable political solution is a two-state solution. I mean, you can't go to democracy. You can't go to a situation where you give the Palestinians equal rights inside a greater Israel, in large part because there are now as many Palestinians as there are Israeli Jews. And over time, the demographic balance shifts against the Israeli Jews and in favor of the Palestinians. And
John Calabro, you've been busy tonight. $5. Yeah, like Scott Morrison, embarrassment to both China and the United States. Yeah. We did these massive lockdowns that took away all of the freedoms of the Australian people, took away our freedom. And then I believe the United States pressured Scott Morrison into doing this. And then Scott Morrison starts mouthing off to China. Man, so yeah, 100% right. We don't need to be mouthing off. And I had a few debates with people over this. People thought that people like me, other observers in this space, thought that someone like me, I was calling for decoupling from China. Hell no. I want to trade with China, continue to be rich, and have a good security relationship with the United States. Just because China is making us rich doesn't mean that we need to do what they tell us to do. And just because the United States is, still controls the seas in Asia, and they're our kind of security guarantor, doesn't mean that we need to do everything to appease them. We should have some sort of independent policy. And this is what Hugh White talked about. And this is why I love Hugh White. Well, I have my issues with Hugh White because Hugh White isn't out there on Lex Fridman podcast. He's not out there getting his name out there, getting his opinions out there, like John Mearsheimer. Hugh White, he could be coming on my podcast here, and then we could get him on a whole bunch of different podcasts. We'll build his reputation up, and eventually he will end up out there. I've been promoting John Mearsheimer when hardly anybody knew him. I think it was back in 2015. He put out a talk that went kind of viral, and I helped to make that go viral. I was sharing it everywhere. I was promoting it. We can do the same for an Australian version of John Mearsheimer, a Hugh White, or really there's only Hugh White. There's no one else. But yeah, the stock of good thinkers in Australia is very slim. And the rest of the geopolitical thinkers, the pretend ones, they're in fact propagandists working for foreign nations, trying to drag us down the wrong path and get Australia in trouble, just like what Scott Morrison did. And Scott Morrison's, he was born into money. His daddy was a police officer, so I doubt he's ever been punched in the face. He's a spoilt little brat. He's never built a business in his life. He's never worked hard. And it got to the point where he had the opportunity to stand up for what's right, defending Australians. And he decides to throw the entire country under the bus. I noticed that the Rode mics, Lex Fridman's got Australian-made Rode mics. Awesome. There's a positive.
In which case you'll end up with a Palestinian state in Greater Israel. So, democracy for all doesn't work. The Israelis, I believe, are quite interested in ethnic cleansing. I think they saw this recent set of events as an opportunity to cleanse Gaza, but that's not going to happen. The Jordanians and the Egyptians have made it clear that that's not happening. The United States has now made it clear that that's not happening, and the Palestinians will not leave. They'll die in place. So ethnic cleansing doesn't work. So you're really left with two alternatives: a two-state solution or a Greater Israel that is effectively an apartheid state. I mean, that's what the occupation has led to. And all sorts of people have been predicting this for a long, long time. And you've now reached the point, here in the United States, if you say that Israel is an apartheid state, that's going to get you into all sorts of trouble. But the fact is that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is the leading Israeli human rights group, all three of those institutions or organizations have issued detailed reports making the case that Israel is an apartheid state. Furthermore, if you read the Israeli media.
Yeah, I think that's just the fact. It's interesting how so many people now, you can't criticize Israel at all. You can't bring up anything that John Mearsheimer is talking about if you're someone else. you can't call it an apartheid state, you'll get in trouble. But when you look at the problems that Australia is facing right now, we are being flooded with the worst kind of immigrants, the most dangerous, violent, 7-foot tall African. It is outrageous what we're doing to ourselves. There could come a point where we need to somehow turn ourselves into an apartheid state to protect ourselves. Why let them in the first place? I just can't believe this. Every city that has had African immigration to their country, it is now unsafe to walk the streets. The Africans will hover around the streets late at night looking for innocent Australians to bash and steal their shit. Right now, it's safe to walk the streets in Sydney, but these Africans, they see us as prey. They're the apex predator of the human race. They're not out to build a business. They're not out to out-trade you. They're not going to try and get better marks in uni than you. They will just wait out the front and bash you and steal whatever shit they can take. And that's just been proven by stats. And so we're letting them in, and we could find ourselves in the same sort of situation in the future, where future Australians need to protect themselves from the African immigrants that they should never have let in. And then next thing you know, John, you're busy tonight. John Calabro, $5 Australian. You can disagree with me, but Tony Abbott was the last good prime minister. The Liberal Party lost my vote when they replaced him during a term. Yeah, I can't remember that. Actually, I kind of remember that. Yeah, he's. Does that mean that you're very religious? Like you're a? Because I remember Tony Abbott was extremely religious. He was a what is he? Is like a Christian. Like, yeah, I don't know, just extremely religious. That's from what I can remember. I think the good thing about someone who is one religious as a prime minister, a good God-fearing politician, is that they always kind of feel like God is watching over them, and so they try to not commit any sins or crimes. You know, as long as they're not like, you know, imagine if we had a Zionist in power, you know, a religious Zionist with, you know, some sort of agenda for a foreign nation. But I get why a Christian Tony Abbott, you know, would be a good one. And yeah, apart from the fact that Tony Abbott, I think he said he was going to shirt front as in shoulder charge Putin if he saw him. That wasn't a very good move. And that's when there were a couple of aircraft carriers off the coast of Australia while Putin was in Australia for what was it? It was the G20 or something like that. But but anyway, let's get back into this.
Yeah, right. All sorts of Israelis, including Israeli leaders, refer to Israel as an apartheid state. It's not that unusual to hear that term used in Israel.
John's going in. He's going in hard.
This is disastrous for Israel, in my opinion. And Steve Walton and I said this, by the way, when we wrote the Israel Lobby, that Israel is an apartheid state, which is equivalent to Israel as an occupier, is not good for Israel. And that brings us back to the two-state solution. But as you and I were talking about a few minutes ago, it's hard to see how you get a two-state solution. And the end result of this conversation is utter despair.
Because the path to a two-state solution is blocked by the amount of hate that's created by civilian deaths.
Well, that plus the fact that the Israeli government is filled with people who have no interest in a two-state solution. They're ideologically deeply committed to a greater Israel. They want all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea to be part of a Jewish state. They're just ideologically committed to that. And of course, as we were talking about before with regard to Hamas, Hamas wants everything between the river and the sea to be a Palestinian state. And, when you have two sides with those kinds of views, right, you're in deep trouble.
Ah, the river and the sea. That's what I was hearing at the protest. I didn't know what it meant, but there are a whole bunch of women at the and they were all women at the pro-Palestinian protests that I saw. I just happened to be walking by, and they were saying from the river to the sea, from the river to the sea. So I guess what they were saying is they don't accept Israel as a state. They want the entire thing to be Palestinian. I didn't know that. And that was in Sydney. That's what I heard. From the river to the sea, they were chanting that. So therefore, they must think maybe they don't accept Israel the same way Israel doesn't accept them. So I guess there is a big issue there with both sides not accepting each other. So there's going to be this war forever.
Trouble because there's little room for compromise. So what you have to do to get this to work is you have to convince the Israelis that it's in their interest to have a two-state solution. And you've already taken care of the PA on this front, the Palestinian Authority, but you've got to convince Hamas that its maximalist goals are not going to work, and it's in its interest to follow in the footsteps of Arafat and accept the two-state solution. But even if you do that at this point, let's say that, there's a lot of willingness intellectually on both sides to do that. The problem is that the hatred that has been fueled by this recent this ongoing conflict is so great that it's just hard to imagine how you can make a two-state solution work at this juncture. That's why I've sort of taken to saying, and I hope I'm wrong here, that, on the two-state solution, that boat has sailed. It's just, it's no longer possible.
Well, again, I believe in leadership, and there's other parties at play here, other nations, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, other players in the Middle East that can help. They can help through a normalization of relationships and these kinds of things. There's always hope, like you said, slither of hope.
Slither of hope.
I think human civilization progresses forward by taking advantage of all the slithers it can get. Let me ask you about, you mentioned the Israel lobby. You wrote a book, probably your most controversial book on the topic.
Not probably. Clearly.
Highly recommended reading. I recommend everybody out there read this book. Well, you probably don't need to buy it. You could probably just I think he's put out quite a few talks on the book, and quite a few speeches, done a lot of interviews.
Really the most controversial book I ever wrote.
So you've criticized the Israel lobby in the United States for influencing U.S. policy in the Middle East. Can you explain what the Israel lobby is, their influence, and your criticism over the past, let's say, a couple decades?
Well, the argument that Steve Walt and I made, actually, we wrote an article first, which appeared in the London Review of Books, and then we wrote the book itself. Our argument is that the lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that push American policy in a pro-Israel direction. And basically, the lobby is interested in getting getting the United States, and here we're talking mainly about the American government, to support Israel no matter what Israel does. And our argument is that if you look at the relationship between the United States and Israel, it's unprecedented in modern history. This is the closest relationship that you can find between any two countries in recorded history. It's truly amazing the extent to which Israel and the United States are joined at the hip. And we support Israel no matter what, almost all the time. And our argument is that is largely due to the influence of the lobby. The lobby is an extremely powerful interest group. Now, it's very important to understand that the American political system is set up in ways that allow interest groups of all sorts to wield great influence. So in the United States, you have an interest group or a lobby like the National Rifle Association that makes it well nigh impossible to get gun control. Yep. Right? And so with the Israel lobby, you have this group of individuals and organizations that wield enormous influence on U.S. policy toward the Middle East. And this is not surprising given the nature of the American political system. So our argument is that the lobby is not doing anything that's illegal or illicit or immoral or unethical. It's just a good old-fashioned American interest group. And it just happens to be extremely powerful. And our argument is that this is not good for the United States because no two countries have the same interests all the time. And when our interests conflict with Israel's interests, we should be able to do what we think is in our national interest, in America's national interest. But the lobby tends to conflate America's national interest with Israel's national interest and wants the United States to support Israel no matter what. We also argue, and I cannot emphasize this enough, given what's going on in the world today, that the lobby's effects, the lobby has not been pushing policies that are in Israel's interest. So our argument is that the lobby pushes policies that are not in America's interest or not in Israel's interest. Now you're saying to yourself, what exactly does he mean by that? What every president since Jimmy Carter has tried to do, as I said before, is to foster a two-state solution, to push Israel, which is the dominant player in Greater Israel, push Israel to accept the two-state solution. And we have run into huge resistance from the lobby whenever we tried to, let's be blunt about it, coerce Israel, right? In a perfect world where there was no lobby and an American president was free to put pressure on Israel, to coerce Israel, I believe we would have gone a long way towards getting two-state solution. And I believe this would have been in Israel's interest. But we couldn't get a two-state solution because it was almost impossible to put meaningful pressure on Israel because of the lobby. So this was not in Israel's interest, and it was not in America's interest. And that was the argument that we made. And we, of course, got huge pushback for making that argument.
What's the underlying motivation of the lobby? Is it religious in nature? Is it similar to the way war hawks are sort of?
I believe that there is a version of the Israel lobby in Australia, and it is almost as powerful. It is building in strength, and it didn't have as much power 5 years ago, but it is gaining in strength within Australia. It is hard to really gauge where it is, where's the money coming from, but you can kind of see the strength of the Israel lobby in Australia gaining power. And I think a prime example is, say, Sky News and a whole bunch of other influencers that are very pro-Israel in Australia. And like what John Mearsheimer just said, sure, we can support Israel because they have a military in the Middle East, which helps us to prop up the petrodollar, which in turn props up the Australian dollar. And, whatever moral issues we might have with all of the death and destruction that helps to facilitate that, well, that's kind of how it is. But it seems to me that the Israel lobby in Australia is starting to try to do the exact same thing, where our entire country is being used purely to send money to a foreign nation. We should have an independent foreign policy that is independent of Israel and the United States. We should be able to push back on many of these issues. But because of how uneducated the population is in Australia when it comes to geopolitics, and because we have so many women that have dominated not only all the big business, HR, all the corporations, the politics in Australia is dominated by women. If you look at the yes vote that they were trying to push so hard, it was middle-aged white women that were pushing that hard. And their attitude was democracy doesn't matter. You have to just listen to us because we are right. And these are the same women that are so naive and stupid and don't understand how the world works, that are allowing interest groups in Australia to gain so much power that they will get to the point where they don't even need the women anymore. And that's kind of how I see what's happening in Australia. It's hard to gauge where it is. I don't have the time to go and try to research these things. I would have to do research on the ground. I'm too busy trying to do my own stuff at the moment.
Militaristic in nature? Is it nationalistic in nature? What's if you were to describe this loose coalition of people, what would you say is their motivation?
Well, first of all, I think you have to distinguish between Jews and Christians. You want to remember that there are a huge number of Christian Zionists who are deeply committed to Israel no matter what, right? And then there are a large number of Jews. The Jews are obviously the most important of those two groups in the Israel lobby. But, one of the arguments that we made in the book is that you should not call it the Jewish lobby, because it's not populated just by Jews, and Christian Zionists are an important part of that lobby. But furthermore, there are a good number of Jews who are opposed to the lobby and the policies that the lobby purveys. And there are a number of Jews who are prominent anti-Zionists, right? So, and they're obviously not in the lobby. Or if you take a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, right? Jewish Voice for Peace is not in the lobby. So it's wrong to call it a Jewish lobby. But with regard to the American Jews who are in that lobby, I think that really this is all about nationalism. It's not so much religion. Many of those Jews who are influential in the lobby are not religious in any meaningful sense of that term, but they self-identify as Jewish in the sense that they feel they're part of a Jewish nation, and that in addition to being an American, right, they are part of this tribe, this nation called Jews, and that they have a responsibility to push the United States in ways that support the Jewish state. So I think that's what drives most, if not almost all, the Jews. This is not to say there's not a religious dimension for some of them, but I think that the main connection is much more tribal in nature.
So I had a conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, and he said fundamentally, if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. So the Zionist project is tied at the hip to the Jewish project. What do you have to say to that?
Look, you can define anti-Semitism any way you want, right? And you can define anti-Semitism to incorporate anti-Zionism. And I think we have reached the point where anti-Semitism is identified today, not just with
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It is very important for you guys to watch this entire podcast. So here's a link. I'll put it into the chat so you guys can watch the whole. You can start from the very beginning, watch the whole thing, and you can watch the end where he goes in. They talk about China as well. I'm only going to cover this part here, Israel and Palestine.
Anti-Zionism, but with criticism of Israel. If you criticize Israel, some people will say, you're an anti-Semite. And if that's your definition of anti-Semitism, it's taken an important term and stretched it to the point where it's meaningless, right? So when Steve and I wrote the book, wrote the article and then wrote the book, all sorts of people said that we were anti-Semites. This is a ludicrous charge, but what they meant was you're criticizing the lobby, you're criticizing Israel, and therefore you're an anti-Semite. Okay, if that's what an anti-Semite is, somebody who criticizes Israel, probably half the Jewish community, if not more in the United States, is anti-Semitic. And of course, you get into all these crazy games where people are calling Jews self-hating Jews and anti-Semites because they're critical of Israel. But even people who are anti-Zionist, I don't think they're anti-Semitic at all. You can argue they're misguided. That's fine. But many of these people are Jewish and proud of the fact that they're Jewish. They just don't believe that nationalism and Jewish nationalism is a force that should be applauded. And you want to understand that in the American context, there is a rich tradition of anti-Zionism. right? And these were not people who were anti-Semites, if you go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s. And the same thing was even true in Europe. There were all sorts of European Jews who were opposed to Zionism. Were they anti-Semites? I don't think so. But we've gotten to the point now where people are so interested in
There's far more Islamophobia than there is anti-Semites in the world. Islamophobia has been pushed by the Israel lobby and the people who control Hollywood and the mainstream media in the United States, worldwide. Islamophobia has been the number one phobia worldwide for 20 years. And it's been pushed by, Israel. So whenever someone calls you an anti-Semite or self-hating Jew or whatever, it's not the biggest one. The most hatred goes towards the Muslims all the time.
Any criticism of Israel, that they wield this weapon of calling people anti-Semites so loosely that the term has kind of lost meaning. So I think Netanyahu is wrong-headed to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Alan Dershowitz was one of the people that called you specifically anti-Semitic. So just looking at the space of discourse, how do you, where's the slither of hope for healthy discourse about U.S. relationships with Israel between you and Alan Dershowitz and others like him?
Well, I think until there is a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's no hope of putting an end to this nonsense, right?
So these are just uses of terms to kind of cheat your way through the discourse.
It's
shortcut.
No, it's to silence people. Right? It's very, very important to understand that one of the lobby's principal goals is to make sure we don't have an open discourse, a freewheeling discourse about Israel. Because they understand, people in the lobby understand that if you have an open discourse, Israel will end up looking very bad, right? You don't want to talk about the occupation. You don't want to talk about how Israel was created, right? All these subjects are ones that will cause problems for Israel. See, just to go to the...
That's exactly right. We can't even have this conversation. This is why people get cancelled. This is why as soon as you bring it up, oh, you're a terrorist. You're supporting terrorism. There's just all of these sneaky tricks. Why don't you condemn Hamas? It's like, can't we have an open discussion about this? No, because Israel will look bad.
Present crisis, okay? When you have a disaster, and what happened on October 7th is a disaster, one of the first things that happens is that people begin to ask the question, how did this happen? Right? What's the root cause of this problem? This is a disaster. We have to understand what caused it so that we can work to make sure it doesn't happen again. So we can work to shut it down and then make sure it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. But once you start talking about the root causes, right, you end up talking about how Israel was created, right? And that means telling a story that is not pretty about how the Zionists conquered Palestine. And number two, it means talking about the occupation, right? It's not like Hamas attacked on October 7th because there were just a bunch of anti-Semites who hated Jews and wanted to kill Jews. This is not, Nazi Germany, right? This is directly related to the occupation and to what was going on inside of Gaza. And it's not in Israel's interest or the lobby's interest to have an open discourse about what the Israelis have been doing to the Palestinians since, I would say, roughly 1903, when the second Aliyah came to Israel, or came to what was then Palestine, right? We want to talk about that. And we don't want to talk about, from the lobby's point of view, the influence that the lobby has, right? It's better from the lobby's point of view if most Americans think that American support of Israel is just done for all the right moral and strategic reasons, not because of the lobby. And when John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt come along and say, you have to understand that this special relationship is due in large part to the lobby's influence, that is not an argument that people in the lobby want to hear. So the point is, you have to go to great lengths for all these reasons. You have to go to great lengths to silence people like me and Steve Walt. And one of the ways to do that is to call us anti-Semites. I think the chapter or the section of the book where we talk about this charge of anti-Semitism is called The Great Silencer, That's what we call the charge of anti-Semitism, the great silencer. Who wants to be called an anti-Semite, especially in the wake of the Holocaust? Do I want to be called an anti-Semite? Oh my God, no. So it's very effective. But, it is important to talk about these issues, in my humble opinion. And I think if we had talked about these issues way back when, it would have gone a long way towards, maybe getting a two-state solution, which I think was the best alternative here.
It's complicated, and I wonder if you can comment on the complexity of this, because criticizing Israel and criticizing the lobby can, for a lot of people, be a dog whistle for sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That this idea that Jews run everything, run the world, or this kind of cabal, and it's also very true that people who are legitimately anti-Semitic are also critics of Israel in the same kind of way. And so it's such a complicated landscape in which to have discussions, because even people like David Duke, who are racist, don't sound racist on the surface. Well, I haven't listened to him enough, but there's dog whistles. And it's a complicated space in which to have discussions, because I wonder if you can sort of speak to that. Because there's this silencing effect of calling everybody anti-Semitic, but it's also true that there is anti-Semitism in the world. Like, there is a sizable population of people that hate Jews. There's probably a sizable population of people who hate Muslims too. But,
a lot of hate out there.
A lot of hate out there. But the hatred of Jews has like a long history, and so you have Rolling Stones have a set of great hits, and there's just a set of great hits of the ways conspiracy theories they can make up about the Jews that are used as part of the hatred. So there's nice templates for that. And I just wonder if you can comment on operating as a historian, as an analyst, as a strategic thinker in this kind of space.
Yeah, we obviously, when we wrote the article, which we did before the book, gave the subject a great deal of thought. I mean, what you say just now is music to our ears. I'm talking about me and Steve. I think that your point about dog whistles is correct. Look, we went to great lengths to make it clear that this is not a cabal. It's not a conspiracy. And in fact, in a very important way, the lobby operates out in the open, right? They brag about their power, right? And this was true before we wrote the article, right? And we said in the article and the book, and you heard me say it here. First of all, it's not a Jewish lobby, right? Secondly, it's not a cabal, right? It's an American interest group. And
the American system is designed such that interest groups are perfectly legal, and some of them are super effective.
Exactly. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly right. And, and there was nothing that we said that was anti-Semitic by any reasonable definition of that term. And, huge numbers of Jews have known me and Steve over the years, and nobody ever said that we were anti-Semitic before March 2006 when the article appeared, because we're not anti-Semitic. But look, you've got this interest group, right, that has a significant influence on American policy and on Israeli policy, and you want to talk about it. It's just important to talk about it. It's important for Jews, right, in the United States, for Jews in Israel, to talk about this. The idea that you want to silence critics is not a smart way to go about doing business, in my opinion. If we were wrong, if Steve and I were so wrong and our arguments were so foul, they could have easily exposed those arguments. They could have gone into combat with us in terms of the marketplace of ideas and easily knocked us down. The problem...
Yeah, exactly. Attack the argument, not the person. And this happens way too often, especially in Australia. People don't want to argue the point. If you have a better argument, if you have better points to be made, make them. But too often, people just attack the person. And this is what Israel does all the time. Oh, you're an anti-Semite. Just slander people who are making good points. And when you look at it from, our point of view, I would say I have, I've learnt so much from John Mearsheimer. that shouldn't we be able to speak about things that could possibly put our country in danger? Shouldn't we be able to talk about that? You know what I mean?
Was that our arguments were quite powerful. And instead of engaging us and defeating our arguments, they wanted to silence us. And this is not good, right? It's not good for Israel. It's not good for the United States. And I would argue in the end, if anything, it's going to foster anti-Semitism. I think you don't want to run around telling people that they can't talk about Israel without being called an anti-Semite. It's just not, it's not healthy in terms of the issue that you're raising, right? But I still agree with you that it is a tricky issue. I don't want to make light of that. You know, I know that there's this piece of literature out there called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I fully understand that if you're not careful, you can come close to writing volume 2 of the protocol. But I don't believe that we wrote anything that was even close to that. And again, I think that a healthy debate on the issues that we were raising would have been not only in America's interest, but it would have been in Israel's interest.
Yeah, I mean, underneath it all is just, I wonder why there's so much hate against groups, why it's such a sticky way of thinking. Not just tribalism, like proud of your country and kind of hating another country, but really deeply hating, like hating in a way where it's part of your identity kind of hate.
Well, just to make a general point on this issue, in our conversation here today, you often talk about individual leaders, and the word individual often pops up in your vocabulary.
Yes.
I believe that we are ultimately social animals before we are individuals. I believe we're born into tribes, we're heavily socialized, and that we carve out space for our individualism. But we are part of tribes or social groups or nations, call them what you want, ethnic groups, religious groups. But the fact is that these tribes often crash into each other. And when they crash into each other, they end up hating each other. If you go to a place like Bosnia, right, the Croats and the Serbs, oh my God, and then throw in the Bosniaks, which is the term for Bosnian Muslims, and, Muslims, Croats, Serbs, and the tribes, hate each other. And in a funny way, that hatred almost never goes away. And I guess there are some exceptions to that. If you look at the Germans after World War II, they've gone a long way towards reducing, I wouldn't want to say completely eliminating, but reducing a lot of the hatred that existed between Germans and their neighbors. But that's really kind of an anomalous case. I mean, you go around East Asia today and the hatred of Japan in a place like China, the hatred of Japan in a place like Korea, just not to be underestimated. And but I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that you're dealing with social groups that have crashed into each other at one point or another, and there are those lingering effects. And by the way, this gets back to our discussion a few minutes ago about trying to get a two-state solution between the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews now that you have had this horrible war, which is ongoing.
It's interesting to go back to World War II. Now, you said you studied Nazi Germany in the 30s from a perspective of maybe offensive realism. But just to look at the Holocaust, it's sometimes popular in public discourse today to compare certain things to the Holocaust. People have compared the Hamas attack on Israel to the Holocaust, saying things like it's the biggest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, which kind of implies that there's a comparison. People have made that same comparison in the other direction. What do you make of this comparison? Is it comparable? Is the use of the Holocaust have any accuracy in comparisons of modern day international politics?
Is it possible that you could have another genocide? Yes. And I would argue that what you had in Rwanda was a genocide, right? The Holocaust is not the only genocide. I believe the word genocide is used too loosely today. And as you know, lots of people, and I mean lots of people who are pro-Palestinian, accuse the Israelis of engaging in genocide in Gaza. I think what the Israelis are doing in Gaza represents a massacre. I would use that term, given the number of civilians that they've killed and the fact that they've been indiscriminate in terms of how they've been bombing Gaza. But I would not use the word genocide. For me, a genocide is where one side attempts to eliminate another group from the planet. I think that what happened with the Holocaust was clearly a genocide, and that the Germans were bent on destroying all of European Jewry. And if they could have gotten their hands on Jews outside of Europe, they would have murdered them as well. That's a genocide. And I think with the Hutus and the Tutsis, you had a similar situation. I think with the Turks and the Armenians during World War I, that was a genocide. But I have a rather narrow definition of what a genocide is, and I don't think there are many cases that qualify as a genocide. The Holocaust certainly does, okay? Now, what Hamas did doesn't even come close to what happened to European Jewry between, let's say, 1939 and 1945, although I date the start of the Holocaust to 1941, if we were, looking at it closely. But let's just say 1939 when they invade Poland. From 1939 to 1945, what Hamas did pales in comparison. It's hard to believe anybody would make that argument, right? Yes, a lot of Jews died, but hardly any compared to the number that died at the hands of the Germans. I mean, it just no parallel at all. And furthermore, Hamas wall, Jabotinsky's term, was misguided. And
yeah,
no, I think if you look at how we reacted to 9/11 and how the Israelis are reacting to what happened on October 7th.
Perfect. That is perfect. They're very similar.
There's quite a bit of similarity in that both sides, the Israeli side and the American side, are enraged, right? And they lash out and they go on a rampage. And the end result is not good.
Is there capacity within Israel or within the United States after 9/11 to do something approximating turn the other cheek, of understanding the root of terror is hate, and fighting that hate with not to sound naive, but compassion?
Well, I don't think in either case you're going to turn the other cheek. I think what I mean by that is some limited, powerful military.
You watch, it's like, what? It's like Lex Fridman's a child sometimes. He's so naive. You see John laughed at him as well. It's like, what are you talking about? And it looks like Lex Fridman has been so sheltered his entire life. Just easy life.
Very response, but very limited.
Yeah, coupled with a smart political strategy.
Diplomacy.
Yeah, that's what they should have done.
Yeah.
Right.
But is there capacity for that? Or from your offensive realism perspective, it's just the odds are really low?
No, from my offensive realist perspective, or my realist perspective, that's what you should do, right? My view is states are rational actors. They should be cunning, right? They should think about the strategic situation they're in and choose the appropriate response. And what happens, and this is why my theory is not always correct, is that sometimes states are not rational and they misbehave. I would argue in the Israeli case that it would have been good after October 7th, or starting on October 7th, if the United States had tried to hold the Israelis back and countenanced a more moderate response, take some time just to think about how to deal with this problem instead of lashing out. I think, given what happened to the Israelis, given how shocked they were, given the level of fear, given the level of rage, they were going to lash out. And I don't believe that was in their interest. I think it would have made sense to think about it and to think about a smarter strategy than they're now employing. And I think, the Americans blew it. The Americans gave them a bear hug and a green light and said, we'll give you all the weaponry you need and go out and do it. And I don't think that was a smart thing to do. Look, in the wake of October 7th, the Israelis had no good strategy. Right. It's not like there's a magic formula that they just didn't see. And we should have told them what the magic formula was. Right. That's not true. They were, in a sense, caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of what to do. But there's smarter things and dumber things. And I think the Israelis lashed out in ways that are counterproductive. I think, going on a rampage and, killing huge numbers of civilians is not, it's obviously morally wrong, but it's also just not in their strategic interest, right? I mean, because it's not going to buy them anything, right? And in fact, it's going to cost them, right? Because people all over the planet are turning against Israel. I saw, an Israeli think tank today that has been tracking protests around the world, gave some figures for what it looked like between October 7th and October 13th in terms of the number of protests around the world that were pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. And then it looked at the numbers from October 13th up to the present. And I think the numbers were 69% were pro-Palestinian in the first 6 days after October 7th, 69%. And I think 31%, take these numbers with a grain of salt, 31% were pro-Israel. So I think it was 69 and 31. Since then, since October 13th, if you look at the number of protests around the world, 95% have been pro-Palestinian and 5% have been pro-Israel. And what this tells you is that public opinion around the world has shifted against Israel. And if you look at some of the demonstrations in places like London and Washington, D.C., it's truly amazing the number of people who are coming out in support of the Palestinians. And all of this, again, is just to support my point that it was just not smart for Israel to launch this bombing campaign. Right. You can make an argument for going after Hamas and doing it in a surgical way, or as surgical a way as possible. But that's not what they did. And again, my point to you is I think that this punishment campaign is not going to work strategically. In other words, they're not going to beat the Palestinians into submission. They're not going to finish off Hamas. And at the same time, by pursuing this strategy, they're doing huge damage to their reputation around the world.
Well, I just, in the wake of October 7th,
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many Australians are aware of this. It seems like Australia, the average Australian's naive to what's really going on. The propaganda is just so powerful here. The average Australian doesn't do any of their own research at all. To hear those stats that 95% of all protests were in defense of the Palestinians worldwide tells you what the world thinks. Yet in Australia, there's still a lot of people believing that Israel's the victim and that it was a terrorist attack that hurt the poor, innocent, weak Israelis, when in fact it's the opposite.
Given the geopolitical context, I think there's a lot of leverage to be the great ethical superpower that demonstrate power without killing any civilians, and use that leverage, diplomatic leverage, to push forward something like Abrahamic Accords with more nations, with Saudi Arabia, push for peace aggressively, peace agreements, this kind of stuff, economic relationships, all of this kind of stuff, and thereby pressure the Palestinian Authority, towards perhaps a two-state solution.
But I think what you're missing here, just in the Israeli case, is that the Israeli government is not interested in a two-state solution. And you want to remember that Benjamin Netanyahu, who looks very hawkish when you look at him in isolation, doesn't look so hawkish when you look at him compared to the rest of the people in his cabinet, right? He almost looks like a moderate. He's got a lot of people who are way out to the right of him. And these people, and this of course includes Netanyahu, are not interested in a two-state solution. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and it's October 7th, late in the day, what do? You're not thinking about a two-state solution. You're thinking about an occupation that's not going to end. And the question is, how do you deal with the Palestinians, given what's just happened?
Well, there's people in the cabinet, and then there's history. And history remembers great leaders. And so Benjamin Netanyahu can look in the streets of Israel and see the protests and think of how history will remember him. And I think a two-state solution is on the table for a great leader.
Well, it was there. Was he the person who was going to take advantage of it? I don't think so, but
he's a student of history. See. Well, at this point, what we'll see, it's very difficult. Like you said, 95% now, or whatever the number is of protests. I think the window in which Israel has the ears of the world, they can do the big ethical peace action towards peace is, I think, is closed. Or maybe there's still a slither, but it's just the slippery slope of hate has taken off. It's quite depressing to watch.
Yep,
what's going on.
I agree 100%. Unequivocally depressing.
But of course, as you talk about the role of the U.S. involvement is of critical importance here for the United States, and the argument you make is that we should not be involved in Ukraine, at least to the degree we are, we being the United States, and we should not be involved in Israel to the degree we are, because it's stretching us too thin. When the big geopolitical contender in the 21st century with the United States is China. Is that a correct summary?
Yeah, I think just on Ukraine, we should not have pushed Ukraine to join NATO.
Sure.
And once the war started, we should have worked overtime to shut it down immediately.
Yeah. March. Yeah.
March, right. And you remember, by the way, not to go back to Ukraine in great detail, in the early fall of 2022, the war starts February 2022. There's March 2022, which we've talked about, which is the negotiations. In the fall of 2022, I think it was in September, the Ukrainians had won two major tactical victories, one in Kherson and the other in Kharkiv.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, now is the time to negotiate, because this is the high watermark for the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Milley understood that things were only going to get worse. And the White House shut Milley down and said, we're not negotiating. So we have blown a number of opportunities here to head this problem off at the pass. But that's my view there. And with regard to the Israelis, my only point about Israel is that it would be better for Israel and better for the United States if we, the United States, the United States was in a position to put pressure on Israel from time to time. As Steve and I say in the book, we should be able to treat Israel like a normal country, right? The fact is that countries sometimes do stupid things. This includes the United States and Israel. And if Israel is pursuing a policy that we think is unwise, we should be in a position where...
Yeah, this is a great point to end. A great point to end this this video. Alrighty then. Well, I'll thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next video.